In the last video, I closed by explaining that while Charles and Parliament have come to an uneasy agreement, Charles II and Parliament, there is tension surrounding what seems to be Charles' implicit support for Catholicism. And this is going to become more of a problem with Charles's brother James. Now, Charles II, although he had many, many illegitimate children, he had no legitimate children, no legitimate heirs. And so attention starts to focus on Charles's younger brother James, who's going to be the heir to the throne. And James had become a Catholic in 1672. His original wife, Anne Hyde, with whom he'd had two daughters, Mary and Anne, had suffered from terminal cancer towards the end of her life. She had converted to Catholicism, and James sees the consolation that her Catholic faith brings her, and this inspires him also to convert to being a Catholic. So now Parliament is very uneasy about the fact that there's a Catholic who's next in line for the English throne. And they try and persuade Charles to disinherit James, but Charles refuses. And Parliament considers excluding James just on their own will, but they decide that they're not powerful enough to do that yet. People still remember the Republic and how miserable it was and how unpopular it was, and so Parliament decide to try and reign and try and work with James. What's significant here is that Parliament already considers that they have the power to choose who becomes king and who doesn't. At first, James practices his Catholic religion, but he maintains the status quo. So you have this strange situation where he's a Catholic, but he's also the head of the church in England, the head of this Protestant church. But at first, James and Parliament work well together. There is a rebellion, however, against James launched by some Protestants. They say, we refuse to accept this Catholic king, even though he's tolerating Protestants. We're going to rebel against him. James goes to Parliament to ask for revenue to put down this rebellion. Parliament grants him the revenue, and he succeeds in crushing the rebellion. Now, James, of course, remembers what happened to his father, who was executed because he failed to suppress a rebellion. And so James is very severe on the rebels and executes many of them. And Parliament is uneasy about this. Next, James demands a standing army. He demands that he should not have to go to Parliament to request an army. He should have Parliament grant him an army. The king is still the commander of the armed forces. Again, James is remembering what happened to his father. He doesn't want to end up in a similar situation. And Parliament refuses because they see this as a reduction in their own power, which of course it is, and they are worried that James is going to try and turn England back into a Catholic monarchy. James next repeals the Clarendon Code. This kind of makes sense because you've got a Catholic in the highest public office in the land. But Parliament still refuses, and so James dismisses Parliament. So relations between the king and Parliament have got significantly worse. Relations continue to deteriorate. In 1687, James issues what he calls the Declaration of Indulgence. The Declaration of Indulgence states that Catholicism is now going to be tolerated publicly in England for the first time since the rule of Mary Tudor, so for the first time in over 100 years. Charles issues this Declaration of Indulgence and commands that it's read from every pulpit in England. He says, I'm the head of the church in England. I demand that every bishop and priest reads out this Declaration of Indulgence, this declaration that Catholicism will be tolerated. And the bishops and priests in England, who are Anglicans, who are Protestants, refuse. And so James responds by arresting them and putting them on trial. Now, typically when the king puts you on trial, you're going to get convicted. But James, by this point, has lost public support. The bishops are acquitted. This is another sign that public opinion has turned against James. Now, Parliament had been okay, even though they didn't really like James becoming king, because they knew that his children from his marriage to Anne Hyde had been raised as Protestants before either James or Anne converted. So they knew that once James died. They had to endure James being the king for a while, and it was going to be rough, but eventually James would die, and he would be succeeded by his daughter Mary, who was next in line to the throne. Mary was a committed Protestant and married to William of Orange. Orange, a region in Holland, Protestant region of Europe. William is a Protestant prince, another committed Protestant. And so for Parliament, there's a sense of, well, we just have to hang on here until James dies. However, James marries again. He marries a Catholic, a Portuguese princess. We're told that she cried the first time that she saw him, which is pretty horrific. But afterwards, relations improved, and she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son. Huge problem for Parliament now, because this son supersedes Mary as heir to the throne. And so now this son, who's being raised as a Catholic, threatens the Protestant endgame here, threatens that there's going to be a Catholic dynasty. And so Parliament now turn to William and Mary, and they encourage them to come to England and overthrow James. They encourage Mary to come to England and take up arms against her own father. And so William and Mary arrive in 1688. They have very little opposition. Again, the winds favor them. They keep James's fleet pinned in the ports, unable to get out there and fight against the Dutch fleet. This is kind of linked with how the wind had changed right before the Spanish Armada attacked the English fleet. Again, the Protestants were successful, so there's this sense that God keeps wanting the Protestants to win. This idea of a Protestant win. William and Mary's propaganda machine is very successful. They portray James as a Catholic tyrant. They gain support, and James is forced to flee the country. And so William and Mary come to rule England, and this is going to have some significant implications. First is an increase in parliamentary authority. Parliament is now picking and choosing who rules over the English. And so in their coronation oath, William and Mary swear that they will pass the laws, they will enforce the laws passed by Parliament. And so this marks the final ceding of any real authority to Parliament. While the kings and queens of England are going to remain important state figures going forward, real legislative power now lies with Parliament. That's, of course, a political lens through which to view these developments. There's also a religious lens. This is a rejection of Catholicism in England that's confirmed by the Act of Settlement in 1701. The Act of Settlement declared that no Catholic, this was passed by Parliament, passed into law, declared that no Catholic could rule England, and this law remains in effect today. You can be a member of any religion under the sun in England, and you can be the king or you can be the queen. But if you're a Catholic, the throne is barred to you. And every now and then you read about someone, no one very close to the throne, but people who are maybe 30th or 40th in line to the throne who have become Catholic. And this means that they have to give up their position in line to the throne. When William dies in 1702, he is succeeded by his sister-in-law Anne, the other daughter of James II, since he and Mary had not had any children, and Anne will rule for another 12 years. Anne also has no children, and so this part of the Stuart dynasty has come to an end. So Parliament has to choose who the new ruler will be, and they choose George I of Hanover. George I is the great-grandson of James I through his eldest daughter, but he speaks no English, and his main qualification for the throne is that he is a Protestant. And so now we've reached this point where England is committed to Protestantism, committed to a powerful parliament, a constitutional setup with a powerful parliament. There are rebellions, Stuart rebellions led by James II's son in 1715, 1726, and then by his grandson, more famous, Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745. But both of these, all of these rebellions are defeated, and this ensures that England will remain Protestant, predominantly Protestant, and with governing power resting primarily with Parliament.